In continuation from my previous video on the Reliant Scimitar GTE, we now take a look at the second generation of this famous marque within the British sports car scene, as it was revived on a thoroughly modern machine that helped to jumpstart the trend for UK drop-top roadsters in a time when larger car firms were withdrawing from this particular market, the resultant model being dubbed the Reliant Scimitar SS1. The SS1's origins date back to around 1977, where, after having abandoned a concept for a people carrier following a corporate reorganization of the Reliant firm, the company instead opted to revitalize its place in the small sports car market by developing a machine that would be placed below the larger Scimitar GTE, essentially a spiritual successor to the aging and ailing MG Midget being built by British Leyland, Reliant aware that their rivals at British Leyland were rapidly attempting to exit this market segment as their various small sports car models failed to maintain their popularity. Their predictions being that by the time Reliant's new prospective model was released, there would likely be no domestic competitors left to steal away sales. Under the auspices of Reliant chief engineer Ed Osmond, who himself graduated under British Leyland and had been involved in the development of the Triumph TR7 in the early 1970s, he began investigating the opportunities for producing a new sports car that would bridge the gap between the MG Midget and the MGB in size and market position. But unlike the Scimitar GTE, which used a stressed GRP body on a separate steel chassis, the new sports car, codenamed SS1 or Small Sports 1, would be based on the underpinnings of a contemporary mass-production saloon car. The opportunity to follow this method was presented in the fact that Reliant had been subcontracted by Vauxhall to customize their Chevette hatchbacks, while, at the same time, Vauxhall Bedford's design director, Wayne Cherry, was developing a potential small sports car of his own called the Vauxhall Equus, which was to be produced in cooperation with Panther Westwinds, who had manufactured the running prototypes, and presented a sharply styled convertible two-seater with an evolution of Cherry's characteristic droop-snoot front styling from the 1966 XVR and Chevy Caprice-style headlight clusters, although the Equus, despite much promise, never made it beyond the concept stage. With the Equus project having come to naught, Osmond decided that the SS1 would be developed independent of any other large car firm, and created in a manner that would reinvigorate interest in the traditional British open-top sports car, as per the MG Midget, MGB, and Triumph Spitfire, being a relatively cheap two-seater model with nippy handling, although it would also incorporate modern mechanical components to improve the reliability of the model against cars which had dragged down the reputation of the British sports car, such as the TR7, while long-term aspirations for the SS1 were that it would become the firm's major break into the US market, hoping to establish distribution deals similar to those which had allowed Austin Healey, MG, and Triumph to thrive, although this incurred the problem that, in order to be sold in the United States, the car had to meet the stringent requirements of the American legislation. For styling, the famous Giovanni Michelotti of Turin, who, through his long-standing association with Triumph, had styled such classics as the Spitfire, the TR4, the TR5, and the Stag, was called in to design the SS1's body, presenting his proposal to Reliant at the end of 1978, the car adopting a style similar to that of the Triumph TR7, and was claimed to have been derived from a previous restyling concept for the Spitfire, the resultant machine being an angular but very modern-looking sports car. For mechanics, the SS1 would follow the tradition of a front-engined rear-wheel drive configuration, although a mid-engined front-wheel drive concept had been previously considered, but was dropped due to uncertainty as to its performance and handling characteristics, Osmond planning a steel backbone chassis, similar in appearance to that of the Lotus Elan, with an elongated X-shape in plan with a deep central tunnel that was very stiff in torsion, through which the prop shaft would be run, although unlike the Lotus cars, in which the GRP body was stressed along with the chassis, the SS1's body construction was to be optimized on computer using finite element analysis, the complexity of this design method requiring construction to be outsourced to the Thyssen Company of Bielefeld, West Germany, which, as part of a deal signed between themselves and Reliant, retained some intellectual property rights over the design, though Reliant took an initial 46% stake in the tooling, later increased to 60% by 1986, at a total value of £1.15 million. In order to allow for a variety of options for the SS1 to appeal to a younger customer base, Reliant had trouble sourcing a suitable engine, with British Leyland, Vauxhall, Fiat and Toyota power units all considered, eventually choosing 1.3 and 1.6-litre versions of the Ford CVH engine from the Ford Escort, while 4- and 5-speed gearboxes and differentials were introduced from the upcoming Sierra, and the powertrain was positioned as far back as possible in order to obtain 50-50 weight distribution so as to improve handling. Tested at the Motor Industry Research Association facility in Nuneaton, Osmond and his team optimized the chassis, dampers and suspension, incorporating a double wishbone suspension system with coil springs and an anti-roll bar for the front, and trailing arms and coil springs with an anti-roll bar for the rear, although in 1981, amid falling sales for the wider Reliant firm, as a rise for cheaper four-wheeled hatchbacks began to erode sales for the company's famous three-wheelers, the SS1 project was put on hold while the JF Nash Securities Holding Company broke up the Reliant Motor Group, floating the firm independently on the unlisted securities market while retaining other companies such as Press Operations, formerly Reliant's chassis supplier. Eventually, the Nash family itself remained in overall control of the Reliant Motor Company, but for the 1981 fiscal year, the firm had reported a loss of £1 million and forced a reduction of its workforce to only 450 by 1982, while speculation existed as to a possible buyout by Hyundai of South Korea, wherein the Reliant company would become a UK importer and distributor for the firm, although in any event, this scheme never materialized, and despite the turmoil of this period, the company continued to press on with SS1 development, although in order to still be a competitive sports car on the US market, the designers introduced friendly fenders made of reinforced reaction injection molded polyurethane, produced in conjunction with Dunlop. Due to the car's copious use of polyurethane molds, it was found that regular RRIM polyurethane was not stiff enough for the unsupported horizontal panels such as the boot lid and bonnet. A mixture of pressed GRP and the Lotus patented vacuum-assisted resin injection, or VARI, was employed, and involved sandwiching polyurethane foam between two layers of fiberglass mat in a precision-fitted mold, with a vacuum being applied between the sealed molds and a measured quantity of polyester resin injected. While theoretically, the VARI process allowed for precise dimensional and weight control, in Reliant's case, due largely to their inexperience with this still fledgling method, expensive assembly problems were incurred throughout the entire course of production, a 1988 audit indicating that for each car, Reliant were producing 2 bonnets due to problems in getting the size right, while in order to save other assembly costs, the doors, headlamp surrounds, rear deck, and one-piece cabin, floor pan, bulkhead windscreen surround were all produced using hand-laid GRP. The general problem with the Scimitar SS1 was the fact that Reliant, while, at the time, Britain's second largest car maker, didn't have the same levels of advanced technology available to other major car firms such as General Motors, which utilized laser-guided mill and drill systems as part of the assembly behind the similar Pontiac Fiero, meaning the SS1 relied on the manual assembly of the panels, which resulted in not every one matching correctly, examples including the panels being of different curvatures that led to inconsistent gaps, while the correct shrinkage tolerance for the type of plastic used within the production run was not accounted for, and therefore led to visibly mismatched panels between individual cars. A further complication was the passing of Giovanni Michelotti in 1980 from cancer, before the SS1's design had been finalized, and while Michelotti's son, Edgardo, took over management of his father's Ital design studio in Turin, the management of the SS1 project was done by Ital chief stylist Taddeo Uchida. The inconsistencies between Michelotti's original concept and Uchida's attempt to finalize what the progenitor had intended, leading to an oddly proportioned car, which still carried over much of what had been initially input when pen first hit paper back in 1977, meaning by the time the SS1 was launched at the 1984 Birmingham Motor Show, the dated design of the car was very evident when compared to contemporary equivalents like the Lotus XL. Despite the car's launch, production problems continued to abound, and with the Reliant company still struggling to maintain competitiveness in the economy car market against the likes of the Ford Fiesta, what little investment was available had to be rerouted into projects which guaranteed immediate returns, such as the Reliant Fox utility truck, meaning SS1 development continued to stumble, while in early 1984, one of the prototypes was destroyed by a fire at the Two Gates Reliant factory in Tamworth, costing the firm £250,000 in lost equipment and construction facilities. With an estimated £5 million having been invested into the SS1 project, although Reliant's accounting policy meant much of this expense was written off, the car entered sales in 1984 as a complementary model to the existing Scimitar GTE and GTC, the intention being to establish the Scimitar as its own range of models that would make minimal use of the Reliant brand, and upon its launch, the SS1 received favourable reviews as it continued the legacy of historic British sports models like the MGB and Triumph Spitfire, which, as correctly predicted back in the 1970s, had long been discontinued by 1984. While the handling and road manners were praised by motoring critics, the styling of the car was a bone of contention, as the general profile and forward-folding Porsche 928 style pop-up headlights were generally considered dated for the mid-1980s. But regardless, competitive pricing at a mere £7,000 for the 1.3 and £8,000 for the 1.6 meant it was a cheaper alternative to the Lotus XL. Although early production problems and a continued struggle with the vary moulding process meant only 36 of the 50 pre-production units were made available by 1985, but this was rapidly amended thanks to an influx of employees as the company recovered from its financial woes during 1982, the car being assembled in the same production line as the Reliant Fox and Rialto three-wheeler, at a rate of 40 cars per week. The issue was getting the car sold, as while Reliant had 38 existing Scimitar dealers across the UK, more were needed to make sure the SS1 was competitive against the likes of Lotus and TVR. This lack of suitable sales agents and channels reflected in the fact that only 600 units were sold during 1985, while due to the somewhat wasteful nature of Reliant's troublesome plastic moulding process, of which many of the panels were misshaped and therefore didn't fit their respective cars, and supply issues from the Thyssen-built chassis, meant a huge stockpile of spare parts was accumulating within the Tamworth factory, taking up much-needed assembly space. By the beginning of 1986, Reliant had expanded their distribution network to 80 dealers, although many were franchise operations shared with TVR and Lotus, who were selling similar models, the SS1 being seen as the odd one out when compared to the Lotus XL and the TVR Tasman. This mixture of poor sales and improper construction, meaning Reliant was losing around £1,000 per working day, with an annual cost of approximately £500,000 due to quality control problems and low production volumes, Reliant only returning to profit in 1987 after signing a deal with Ford to mould the composite bodies for the RS200 mid-engine sports car, while the rights to the Scimitar GTE and GTC, which had been discontinued in 1986, were sold off to the Middlebridge Scimitar Company, and the Shenstone-based spare parts division was acquired by Unipart. Amid Ed Osman's departure as chairman of Reliant in 1985, in order to take on management of car bodies and their Austin FX4 taxicab production, rumours circulated as to Reliant being bought by either Lotus or Ford, due to its expertise in plastic manufacturing. Although with the inclusion of the Reliant firm as part of the Metro Cab project, a taxicab launched by Metro Camel Wayman in 1986 as a competitor to the classic FX4 London Black Cab, it became clear that Reliant would instead focus on subcontracting its plastic moulding services to other builders and firms in order to stay profitable, although the company refused to abandon its struggling SS1. In fact, with the profits made from their assistance in the highly successful Metro Cab scheme, Reliant continued to develop an amended version of the SS1 which would be suitable to meet US emissions and safety standards for sale in America, choosing to replace the original Ford Escort engine with a 1.8-litre unit from the Nissan Silvia, providing a power output of 122 horsepower and coupled to a 5-speed Nissan gearbox, the modified SS1 being christened the Reliant Scimitar 1800 Ti upon its launch in late 1986, the 1800 Ti being perhaps the pinnacle of the SS1 design philosophy, as it presented a top speed of 130 miles an hour and a 0-60 time of 7.2 seconds, putting it on par with big game like the Porsche 944 and the Ford Sierra RS Cosworth. Despite the 1800 Ti pushing the retail price up to £10,300, left-hand drive exports comprised nearly half of Scimitar sales by mid-1988, the completion of a new £250,000 paint facility at Kettlebrook providing a high-quality finish to this new range of Scimitars, and although the SS1 was a major seller in Europe, with dealer networks in the Netherlands, France and Switzerland, sales to the United States had yet to begin, with initial proposals being for Scimitars to be sold through Jaguar dealerships in North America. But sadly the company's transatlantic aspirations didn't occur, and the car would never venture stateside in an official capacity. With its failure to sell in the United States, the proposed creation of the Scimitar Motor Company, as a separate division of the wider Reliant firm, never came to fruition, and despite a replacement model, dubbed the SS2, being commissioned by General Motors and styled by Aston Martin Lagonda designer William Towns, the car never went beyond the concept stage, and in February 1990, after only 1,500 examples had been built, the Reliant Scimitar SS1 was dropped, by which time Reliant was losing approximately £300 on the Scimitar 1400 due to tooling and production costs, and making a marginal profit of £40 on the 1800 Ti. While the original SS1 had come to an end, many of the features previously considered in the SS2 concept were incorporated into a modified revival of the car dubbed the SST, this car being launched in 1990, and utilised an entirely revised construction, as well as an amended styling, to try and iron out as many of the faults that had plagued the SS1, including the use of a semi-monocoque design fixed directly to the chassis, and the fitting of the bodywork through two large pieces, front and rear, that did not suffer the unsightly panel gaps of the previous SS1, while power came from the 1800 Ti's Nissan engine, producing 135 horsepower, and the 1400's Ford CVH engine, producing 75 horsepower, both of which were married solely to a 5-speed manual gearbox. The SST lasted until 1992, whereupon it was replaced by the final Scimitar model to be produced, the Scimitar Sabre, which revived the moniker of the original Sabre sports car from the 1960s, and was launched with the same 1.4-litre Ford and 1.8-litre Nissan engines before introducing a comprehensive restyle in 1993, alongside the addition of the 1.4-litre Rover K-Series engine from the Rover 200, resulting in a top speed of 113 miles an hour and a 0-60 time of 9.4 seconds, the Scimitar Sabre being merely a limited production model for enthusiasts before the entire scheme was wrapped up in 1995, ending the Scimitar name after 31 years of circulation. In the end, while the Scimitar SS1 had many problems with its production and the inexperience of Reliant when it came to developing the complex plastic moulding of the body, the concept was not one without merit, as it showed that the same traits that had made British sports cars popular during the 1950s and 60s could be evolved to suit the modern taste of the 1980s and 90s, the model being something of a trailblazer that eventually led to the creation of far more successful equivalents such as the Mazda MX-5, the Lotus Elan M100, and the MGF, although the SS1 itself would not share in the same glory, as the Reliant company simply hadn't the capital to afford mistakes, and with its failing position in the marketplace, the SS1 could not be pushed through to a more favourable position against its rivals, and would instead languish as an obscure little machine, but one fondly remembered by those who recognise it.